Although the drought has broken for much of rural Australia, large pockets of the country still remain in gloomy circumstances, with many communities facing an uncertain future. The northeastern agricultural region of Western Australia, an area of around 3 million hectares, approximately 400 kilometres northeast of Perth, it's the hatched area you're looking at on the map, is still recovering from two devastating seasons of drought in 2006 and 2007. The area is defined by an average rainfall of 300 to 400 millimetres, but has suffered a run of poor seasons since 2000, culminating in 3 disastrous years from 2005 through to 2007, when it received less than 250 mil for each year. Consequently, the farm businesses in the region have made losses in 6 of the past 11 years. In 2007, the second year of the drought, the dust storms were unbelievable. Without ground cover from previous years, topsoil was getting blown in waves across the landscape, all the way from Mullewa to Geraldton. On particularly bad days, the dust storms were like a fog of sand that would bank up on fences and transform major roads into sand tracks. Many farmers were going to the wall and were forced into selling up, and unfortunately there were several suicides in the region. It was an extremely difficult time. In response to these exceptional circumstances, the West Australian Department of Agriculture and Food ran a workshop to help its employees understand how financial hardship and other difficulties triggered by drought were affecting the mental well-being of farmers and those in rural drought-affected areas. One aspect of that workshop that really stood out for me was a segment about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Having struggled with loss in my own life, I could relate to these stages of grief. But as discussion moved to the early warning signs of distress, I became uncomfortable, because it was as though they were describing me. I suddenly realised I was in difficulty and needed some help. On an artistic level, I felt I had made another connection. Perhaps I could use drought as a metaphor to speak about distress, a way to document the journey through the shadowlands of loss, grief and despair. What ensued was a very cathartic, therapeutic process, resulting in many of the artworks you are seeing in this slide presentation. By collecting discarded maps and soaking them in rust and tannic and indigo dyes, screen printed with iconic agricultural images, I referenced drought in the landscape. Some maps I ripped and tore before taping and reattaching them to other pieces. I used the fragility and fragmentation of these processes, combined with their subject matter, to create a visual language communicating the process of loss and grief. The parallels between drought and distress are obvious and frightening. Drought is unlike most other natural disasters. It is insidious and sinister. It creeps up on you, slowly, day by day, starving the land in a siege of blue skies, hot days and dust storms. Gradually it overcomes you, grinding you down, suffocating all your hopes and expectations. I distinctly recall a conversation I had with an elderly farmer back in 2007. He was being forced from the family farm because of the drought. He said he would be leaving the following week and was spending his last few days on the property, wandering about, looking at the infrastructure he and his father had built, wondering what the future held for he and his family. I also remember the many comments I heard concerning the all-consuming nature of the drought, how its stressful presence never left you. From the moment you awoke in the morning until you slept that night, whatever you did or wherever you went, the menace of the drought was everywhere, hovering over every thought and conversation you had. At some point in our lives, it's likely we'll experience a dark period of great sadness. It may be the loss of a loved one, or a relationship breakdown. It might be sickness, injury, or disability, or perhaps an injustice, an abuse, or a betrayal of some kind. But when disaster strikes, it can shock, debilitate and disorientate us. And we're surprised and stunned that life can do that. It's when we come to that place of despair that everything can become painful and pointless, and it's very easy to give up. It was Theodore Adorno who said, "But he who dies in despair has lived his whole life in vain." So how do you move on from that place? How do you continue? While pain is the gift that nobody wants, strangely, there is a time when we can begin to see its value. When we begin to recognize and review our situation, we seek help and start making good decisions. We begin to look beyond ourselves and realize that we're not the only ones, that others are also struggling, and perhaps we can help them. It's a battle and it takes time, but we can make it through. Marcus Aurelius said, "The art of living is more like wrestling than dancing." The end of our pain can become something beautiful and enriching, something worthwhile and deeply meaningful. We can become wiser for our experience, more gracious, forgiving and compassionate. It's ironic, but what we may have thought was a fatal blow can instead become our defining glory. Martin Luther said, "Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree."